So we've got to dig these out. We've got to recognise these are issues and address them carefully. Now finally, we're moving to food. I pointed out that demand for food, assessed by the UN, needs to increase by something of the order of 50% to meet that increasing demand. But it's an increase in demand that is not constant. The increase in demand is primarily coming into demand for livestock and dairy products and more sophisticated agricultural products. And of course, I'm talking to an expert audience here, and always I'm talking to an audience who know more about a subject than I. That's the fate of being a chief scientific advisor. The pressure on the agricultural system is significantly increased. So the simple 50% increase productivity is enormously underestimated by the fact that large increases in demand for livestock and dairy products and more sophisticated agricultural products means that the ability of the agricultural system to produce this needs to be addressed. Let me look at the next slide. This is an interesting study which I've annotated. I can't pronounce the acronym, I will just say it to you. This is a study by the IAASTD. In the United Kingdom, our civil servants work hard to come up with acronyms which you can actually pronounce. They can be used in this case. I can't pronounce IAASTD. But this is a study which was published last year. It looks at population, it looks at the amount of available agricultural land, and it divides the one by the other. And as you can see from the right-hand histogram, you're seeing a decline due to increasing population, and they're not making any more land. You're seeing a decline in the amount of land, cultivated land per person. And what I've done on this slide is extrapolated to 2030. In 2030, there'll be 8.3 billion people, give or take. 60-odd% will be living in the urban environment. Provide that, and if anything, available land will be less, unless we do something completely crazy like chop down tropical rainforests, available agricultural or plough up permanent grassland, and again I emphasise we've got to recognise the interaction of the three security issues of food, water and energy with climate change. We cannot meet food security issues in a way that significantly erodes our ability to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So that, in a sense, is a massive problem. Let me have the next slide, please. Let's just look at history. This is a slightly complicated slide, so I'll go through it slowly. This shows, on the white rectangles, shows the productivity in the 1960s, scaled to 100. That indicates the change in productivity on the left-hand graph in Africa, going up to 2001. Increases the production of agriculture in cereals, in this case, by about 240–250%. A similar, different shape graph is shown in Asia, where again the scale is the same, an increase slightly larger than in Africa. But look at the way that it's done. In Asia, that is done not by increasing the amount of land that's used, but by increasing the productivity per unit of land. So the reason agricultural production has gone up in one area is due to taking in more land out of other activities into agriculture. And the other has been done by an increase in productivity. A very telling issue when we worry, as I'll come on to a little bit later, issues of biodiversity and so on, ecosystem services. And climate change interacts. The next slide, please. This goes too far into the future, but I think it illustrates the point that I want to make. That changes in agricultural production due to climate change are well understood. One of the odd characteristics of the climate models is they're much more accurate at predicting a long way ahead than into the near future. That sounds crazy and counterintuitive. There are good reasons for that. But what it says looking to 2080, and the red is showing significant declines in agricultural production in large areas of the world. That's to 2080. 2060 will be not quite as severe. 2050, 2040, And what you can see from this is that the green, essentially the northern temperate zones, are going to be benefiting in a significant way, whereas to the south, and particularly in some of the areas where we have major problems, you're going to have a decline in agricultural productivity. Now, here, this is where the Copenhagen process is so important, because these are declines which will be enormously exacerbated if we fail to limit greenhouse gas emissions over the next 2 decades. If we do so, those pictures will be seen as probably optimistic assessments. So we cannot avoid the climate change on the medium term. But the picture from that is saying, essentially, the northern temperate zones will do okay. Europe is not going to have a problem of producing enough food. There will be regional differences. The Mediterranean area will have enormous problems due to the lack of water. There's detailed climate change predictions that have been made which indicate that where these problems are, there's going to be problems as you move north, the melting of the permafrost and so on. But to a first approximation, Northern Europe, including the United Kingdom, will not have major problems of agricultural production, except at a small scale and regional scales. We need to adapt, but I have confidence that the industry can do that. Let's move to the next slide. And this is a very strange map of the world. It's a very strange map of the world because what we've done is we have shrunken those areas of the world which don't have a food problem, and we've enlarged those areas of the world where there is a food problem. So as you can see, Europe, the USA, South America is shrunk, but Africa and Asia have been expanded enormously. And that reflects almost the issue of how we're going to address the future of the world in terms of food. Can't ignore water and energy and climate change, but this, I think, is it. And I think that there is potentially a moral issue here. We understand, since the work of the economist Ricardo, about the way in which different areas of the world and different societies and different economies have different excellences and comparative advantages. I think that there is a genuine comparative advantage in Europe to produce food over the next several decades. And I think that this is, I'm a scientific advisor, I don't talk on moral questions, but I think it is a legitimate occasionally to say, is there a moral issue here in terms of food production? And I think this is quite a graphic illustration of the way in which the needs of different areas of the world are shown as being either very large, like an expanded picture of the world projection, or much smaller, as shown by a reduction of that world picture. But I'm focused on all these productivities that will keep our society much as we know it. But there's a whole area that I really haven't touched on, and we should touch on, we probably should touch on. Next slide, please. Biodiversity. Even if we were only to focus on food, and think about biodiversity, the ecosystem processes, and the ecosystem services that are delivered, and these are enormously important. You can see, even if we focused on food, we've got to think about biodiversity and the way that ecosystem processes are used to help us not just to do food, but to deal with climate regulation, the issues of the regulation of storms and floods. We had what was termed in the media a 1 in 1,000-year event in the United Kingdom in the northwest this year, this month. Tragic destruction of human life with, as I say, what was termed a 1 in 1,000-year event. The problem is, in July 2007, we had another 1 in 1,000-year event. Now, it seems to me that two events that occur once in 1,000 years, having 2 years out of 3, is probably stretching the idea of 1 in 1,000-year event rather farther than I would choose to do it. I think we've got to recognize there are issues, and the ability, for example, to absorb floods by some of our ecosystems have got to be recognized. And we have, and I believe we have, a moral responsibility in the human race to think about that species.